Thank you, Rupin, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here today to talk about something we've heard a lot about in the media over the past year, and we're going to hear a lot more about over the coming weeks and months. And that is what's happening in terms of international migration in Canada. As I think you probably know, we've been on a bit of a roller coaster ride in terms of the numbers, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But things are changing, and so what I'd like to do is to focus on those changes, what it means for the consumer base that you deal with. A slowdown in some areas, maybe even a decline in the actual size of the number of consumers in some areas. So first of all, we'll spend the first two parts talking about international migration, a little bit about the background. How do we get to where we are today? And what are the policy changes that the government has announced over the past year or so? And then we'll delve a little deeper behind the scenes into how those new policies are playing out. Are they starting to bring results? And what does that mean? And where are those results impacting a little bit more than in other places? And then finally, I'll spend just a bit of time on internal migration. We've also, in addition to international migration, seeing some post-COVID changes in patterns of internal migration, which of course combines with the international numbers to reshape the size and characteristics of the consumer base in various parts of the country. So first of all, let's look back. Where have we been? And in looking at international migration, there are two important streams we should differentiate. One are immigrants or permanent residents, that is, people who come to the country with the idea of staying here for the long term. The other is what we call non-permanent residents or temporary residents, including international students, temporary workers, asylum claimants. So we'll look at both of those. First of all, if you look at the left-hand panel, we can see the pattern of immigrants coming into Canada over the past 7 or 8 years. And a couple of things are noticed. For the first 4 or 5 years of that trend, numbers were pretty constant. We were bringing in somewhere on average around 260,000 new permanent residents a year. And that actually was a number that was pretty constant if we go back 20 years or so, back to the turn of the century. But as you can see, in the last 3 years, the numbers really jumped. Not quite double, but close to double. And that increase was a direct result of government policy. The federal government announces targets for immigrants once a year when they table an immigration report to Parliament, generally in the first week of November. And the numbers were increased substantially 2 or 3 years ago and were remaining high. And in fact, until recently, the target for this year, 2025, was actually 500,000 immigrants, which was double that long-term number. If we look at the non-permanent numbers, we don't have data going back historically as we do with immigrants, but we do have data for the last 3 years. And you can see there that even in that 3-year period, the number of non-permanent residents coming into the country increased from somewhere around 700,000 to about 1,800,000, a substantial increase. We do have estimates from StatsCan about the net number of non-permanent residents, that is the ins minus the outs. And as you can see, for many years, they were pretty low, but they really jumped in the last couple of years. And if you add those numbers of net non-permanent residents, around 700,000, 800,000 a year, to the 400,000 to 500,000 immigrants, we actually added 2.5 million people to our population over about a 24-month period. Clearly numbers that were not sustainable, and as a result of that, the impact that was housing on things like housing, healthcare services, social services, other kinds of services, the government decided to pull back from their original targets. And they did so on both fronts, on the immigration numbers and on the non-permanent numbers. First of all, on the immigration side, as I mentioned, we had seen somewhere around an average of 475,000 a year over the last 3 years or so. And as I mentioned, that was up substantially. They were targeting 500,000, but they announced in the report to Parliament last November that they wanted to reduce those numbers to 395,000 for this year, and then dropping a little more to 365,000 in 2027. So the reduction of 20 to 25%. The non-permanent side, the changes were even larger. There, the way the government looked at the non-permanent residents was to look at the stock or the number of non-permanent residents who are living in Canada at any one time. And just before their announcement, a little over a year ago now, there were about 3 million non-permanent residents in the country, combination of students, workers, refugee claimants. And that represented 7% of our total population. And that was up from 5% just about a year earlier, and from a little over 3% a couple of years earlier. So a dramatic increase. What the government announced was that they wanted to bring down the number of non-permanent residents in the country so that it would reach 5%. So a return to that March 2024 number, or 23 number, I guess. And that would mean a drop from a little over 3 million to around 2 million. That means there would have to be a net outflow of non-permanent residents of over 1 million over the course of the next couple of years. And that target was to be reached in 2027. Well, before we look at how that's playing out, what's the impact of this? Well, the impact is a big reduction, a big slowdown in the rates of population growth that we saw. Prior to last year, we were growing at about 3% for each of the 2 years. And that we estimate for this year, the final numbers aren't in yet, but we did some estimation, and we expect the rate to have dropped to a little over 1%, between 1 and 1.5%. So a substantial pullback, and we'll see the reasons for that in a minute. We expect growth to continue to decline over the next 2 years before, under current policy, things return to more historical levels of 1 to 1.5% growth. And you could really see the impact of that more clearly by looking at what happened in the first quarter of this year, which was the first period when both new policies on permanent and non-permanent residents were in effect. And you can see that for the first quarter, if we annualize the rate, there was virtually no change in Canada's population. And in fact, in the 3 large provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and BC, the population actually is estimated to have declined slightly. Still some growth in some areas, but right across the country, a real pullback in growth, a real pullback, slowdown in terms of the growth of the consumer base, and even perhaps actual declines in some areas. So let's look behind the scenes at how this is playing out. First of all, we'll look at the non-permanent residents. We now have about a year of experience under the new policy that the government announced in the spring of 2024. And we can see there's been a 42% drop in the number of non-permanent residents coming into Canada, a drop of nearly 600,000 fewer people in the last 12 months compared with a year earlier. And you can see the breakdown. The drop in students was actually highest, over 50% drop, nearly a 40% drop in temporary workers, and even a drop in asylum claimants. That's not a number that's targeted by the government, but it so happened that came down as well. So overall, a pretty substantial cutback. We still were receiving somewhere around 1.2 million non-permanent residents coming into the country. It was down from the 1.8 million, but still substantial numbers. So, what does this mean in terms of the government's target? Well, after the government announced the change, the numbers kept rising for a couple of quarters since there was a built-in momentum in terms of the numbers of people coming in on a non-permanent basis. But that's now started to turn around. And so after peaking at somewhere around 7.4% of our population, at the end of the first quarter this year, StatsCan estimates the number was down to 7.1%. We expect to get the numbers for the second quarter in the next week or two. My guess it'll be down to 6.7, 6.8%. So heading towards that 5% target over the next couple of years. And just as a bit of a sidebar, one of the challenges in trying to estimate how many non-permanent residents there are in the country is that while we have a good fix on the numbers coming in, we don't have exact data on the numbers who are leaving. People are expected to leave the country if their permits expire, a student permit or a work permit. But there's no exit visa, no exit tracking that's done. And so the estimates that StatsCan makes some assumptions, heavily built on the fact that people are expected to leave shortly after their expiry, their permits expire. So how does this play out across the country? Which markets are likely to be more affected? First of all, if we look at the provincial level, all provinces experience declines, pretty similar declines. A little bit less of a decline in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Quebec, but overall between 40 and 50% decline in all the other provinces. However, if we drill down a little bit more into looking at the urban areas of the country, we start to see some differences. And these differences are really due to the numbers or the concentration that non-permanent residents have in different parts of the country. And this chart uses our demostats data to show which areas of the country had the highest concentration of non-permanent residents, and therefore these are the areas which would be expected to be hit hardest in terms of the downturn. And you can see the Kitchener-Waterloo area had the highest proportion of non-permanent residents, large numbers of international students in those areas, also temporary workers. Toronto, Vancouver, also quite high. On the other extreme, there are metropolitan areas, smaller, medium-sized areas, where the concentration of non-permanent residents was much lower, and therefore the impact of the pullback will probably be a lot less. There are other ways that we can look at who's impacted, and one of the ways of doing that is to look at the concentration of non-permanent residents in our various PRISM segments. This looks at the case of Toronto and identifies the segments across the city of Toronto which have high concentrations of non-permanent residents, and therefore, as those numbers are pulled back, likely substantial impact on the population in those areas. Indirectly, likely an impact for things like the cost of rental housing, perhaps the cost of consumer goods, non-discretionary, grocery shopping, and things like that. So businesses concentrated in areas which have high numbers of non-permanent residents may start to see, or have already seen, a bit of a pullback in terms of their sales and activity. You can also look at it just geographically. This map shows, again, the city of Toronto and where non-permanent residents are concentrated in the Toronto area. So there are different ways of looking at where the impacts may be higher or lower. Let's look at the other side of the coin, and that is immigration. As we mentioned, the new policy on immigrants only came into effect in January of this year, and so we only have data for the first 6 months of that period. But what's happened, and what was expected to happen, as I mentioned already, was that those numbers were scaled to come down from 475,000 to a little under 400,000 for this year. What have we seen in the first 6 months? Well, we saw a reduction of nearly that 20% that we expect to see, but there was a fairly wide variation in how the pullback has happened across the country. The maritime provinces showed the highest cutbacks, followed by Saskatchewan. Other areas much lower. For example, fairly low reduction in Quebec. Now, one of the reasons for the low reduction in Quebec is that they set their own immigration policy, and their immigration numbers on a per capita basis are fairly low to start with. The intentional Quebec government policies to keep immigration down. So the pullback has not affected them nearly as much as others. But even in the case of Ontario, which receives large numbers of immigrants, the pullback hasn't been nearly as high as in other provinces. Early days still, something we'll want to continue to watch, but variation across the country. And one can look at which immigrant groups are affected. Shows for the case of Metro Vancouver, the 5 largest immigrant groups coming into Metro Vancouver recently. And you can see India, as I'm sure you know, counts for about 1/3 of all our immigrants in the country, and about a similar proportion in Vancouver, followed by China, Afghanistan, Philippines, and Nigeria. And I had a quick look at whether or not the pullback was affecting some groups more than others, and there's not anything that's discernible yet. All groups are being reduced in a similar way. Also, one can look at where are the neighborhoods that are experiencing the drop in immigrants. And this shows the PRISM clusters, again for the Vancouver metro area, of the receiving the highest number of immigrants in recent years, which are areas that we'd expect to see the largest pullback. And the thing that stands out there is that really the numbers are spread out across the area. There's no one segment that dominates the numbers there. These are the top 5. So that's the story on international migration. Just a couple of words end up on within Canada migration, where we've also seen a little bit of a change post-COVID. First of all, an interesting pattern that I observed was to look at just the total number of people moving from one province to another on a year-over-year basis. And what's noticeable for any year, 20 years or so, no discernible trend. Approximately 280, 290,000 people change provinces every year, a little bit of up and down, perhaps in response to economic conditions, other factors, but no real trend until COVID. And then post-COVID, you see how the numbers moving interprovincially really jumped and stayed high for a couple of years, but in the last 2 years seem to be now reverting back to that long-term average of 280 to 290,000. So that temporary bump in interprovincial migration had a differential effect across the country. This shows the importance of interprovincial migration. This is net migration, so there's a lot of churn, if you will, that's important in most provinces. Important in the maritime provinces, and as a result, over the last 3 or 4 years, the maritime provinces have been growing among the fastest in the country, along with Alberta. Clearly, Alberta has been booming after it came out of the downturn in the resource sector and is still growing rapidly. as are the maritime provinces. But we're starting to see a little bit of a pullback now in the maritime provinces. And again, these are estimates for this year. We don't have the final data. Overall, the Maritimes gaining a little bit, but actually New Brunswick losing some population due to interprovincial migration. And you can see the Maritimes, which has been sort of the focus of attention. If you look at what's happened in the Maritimes over a longer period of time. For many years, 10, 15 years ago, the Maritime provinces were teetering on population decline year over year. That started turning around in and around 2015 when they started to attract people from other provinces. You can see that in-migration curve starting to trend upward and took a really big jump post-COVID. People moved into the Maritime provinces, but now those numbers moving in are dropping back to pre-COVID levels. And you can see the out-migration actually declined for many years, in recent years picking up a little bit as well, so that the gap now in terms of what contributes to population growth is getting back to just having no effect. Immigration is still important in the Maritime provinces. We expect the Maritime provinces to continue to grow, but not nearly as much as we've seen in the last number of years. One other aspect of internal migration that we've been monitoring and that I've talked about before is what's happening around our big cities. We've seen now for many years migration out of our big metropolitan areas, particularly Toronto, but also Montreal and Vancouver. No doubt a function of the cost and availability of housing, as well as other factors. For the last 3 years, Toronto probably lost an average of 80 to 90,000 people a year, moving out of the Toronto area to other parts of the province, and in some cases to other provinces. And one can see where are people going. No surprise, out of Toronto, they go not too far afield, places like Oshawa, Hamilton, Barrie, Kitchener, and also substantial numbers moving into what we classify in more rural areas. These are not extreme rural areas. These are what you might call ex-urban areas beyond the boundaries of a metropolitan area, but a fair number moving and settling in those. Similar patterns in Montreal and Vancouver. Again, a considerable movement into more rural type, smaller town areas as well. And who is it that's moving out of, in this case, Toronto? And here we can use our MoverStats data, which tracks mobility in close to real time, and looks at the top 5 PRISM segments from where people are moving out. And you can see the Metro Melting Pot segment 31 had the highest number. No surprise, all of these segments are family segments, people looking for affordable housing, and also young people, that large eat, play, love segment living in downtown Toronto, moving out as they start their families, looking for housing that's more affordable and larger than the cookie cutter condo that they've been living in. One other final word on that movement out of the big cities is that we see growth in many of the smaller urban areas. These are areas under 100,000 population. In census terms, often referred to as CAs or census agglomerations, small urban areas. And so what I've done here on this chart is to list the 20 fastest growing smaller urban areas, and I've classified them just to show a variation in the types of areas that are growing, some attracting younger migrants, some attracting older, probably retirees, and I've overlaid the areas with our Wealthscapes data that shows variation in the wealth, in this case, in terms of liquid assets. So lots of variation, all of these areas growing at a pretty good clip, but different kinds of areas benefiting from that. So let me just summarize where we've been. Overall, we're starting to see the impact of the new government policy. The numbers of both permanent residents, immigrants, and non-permanent residents are coming down, but the change is variable across the country in different places, in different types of neighborhoods. And that growth is going to, that pullback in the numbers is going to result in a real slowdown in growth. We probably won't see much growth nationally at all for a couple of years, and possible declines, particularly in those areas with high concentrations of non-permanent residents, the Kitchener area, the Toronto area, the Vancouver area, the Montreal area, may actually go into population decline for a number of quarters or even years. But lots of variation, as we saw. In terms of where the growth is continuing, Alberta is going to, I think, continue to lead the way, still attracting considerable number of migrants, a lot from Alberta and also from Ontario. And the maritime provinces, as I mentioned, likely continue to grow, but at a slower rate. And many smaller communities starting to grow, continuing to grow at a pretty good rate, in part due to that outflow from the big cities. So I'll leave it there, and we're going to be monitoring these changes. Things are happening. More discussion about particularly the non-permanent residents, the temporary foreign worker program. And I should just mention perhaps a little bit of a sidebar on the non-permanent resident program. The data I presented on temporary workers includes 3 different programs for temporary workers. One is the temporary non-permanent, the temporary foreign worker program. And in fact, that's a fairly small part of all temporary workers in the country, about 15% or so. A much larger program is something called an international mobility program that actually is the program that includes many of the international students who graduate and apply for a work permit to get Canadian experience, many with the hope of eventually transitioning to permanent residency. And that is by far the largest temporary work program. The third program is humanitarian work permits. And there are many people transitioning, have been for a number of years, even higher now, from temporary to a permanent status. Probably somewhere between 50 and 60% of the new non-permanent residents in the country are not new to Canada. They've been here as students or as temporary workers for a number of years and are transitioning. So that sort of pipeline is even more important now than it was. So I'll leave things there. I'm not sure if we may have a few minutes for questions, but I'd be happy to answer those now, or be happy to talk to any of you offline later in the day. Thank you.